Good afternoon, and to some, good morning. We're just going to wait a few more moments. We want to make sure people can join. Bukumni, is everything set? All right, we're ready to proceed. And again, good afternoon and good morning. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Amanda Mueller. I'm the Deaf-E3 project director, and I'm also Gallaudet in Nigeria officer. Thank you for joining today, our Deaf-E3 webinar series. Now, you might be wondering, what is that Deaf-E3? It's strengthening deaf education, empowerment, and employment. USAID generously gave a grant and awarded it to Gallaudet University to support our Deaf-E3 program. And thank you so much to USAID. The GAIN team is leading the implementation for the Deaf-E3. And part of the work that we do is offering this type of educational opportunity through USAID and all of their partners as a series and webinar. Now, before we start, I want to cover language access. We have 4 working interpreters today. 2 of the interpreters are working from ASL to spoken English, and the other 2 interpreters are working from that spoken English into Nigerian Sign Language. We also have CART services. That's real-time communication access translation. If anybody wants to access the CART services, on the bottom of your screen, you click on the closed captioning to start that working. We also have the chat feature for Zoom possible to use. And if people want to just put in a good morning or any types of comments, and also Q&As. We have either the chat feature for that, or you can click on the Q&A. Please use that one for questions. And the reason for that is we want to collect those questions. If we can't answer any of them, we will get back to you. We're going to save all of them. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 2 amazing presenters. Both of them work at Gallaudet University in the language, education, and culture. We have Deanna Gagné. She's natively exposed, trilingual to American Sign Language, Spanish, and English. And her research interests involve children and language acquisition as it relates to cognition. And if you were to come to DC, and I hope all of you do come visit, especially to come visit Gallaudet University, we're open and welcome. But here in DC, we have a new museum called Planet Word. And Denise is heavily involved in the implementation of that museum. We have another presenter, Ms. Pamela Decker-Wright, and her interests include language endangerment, language deprivation, and diversity among sign languages. She's a well-published author. She has several books and magazines, articles, and she's a wonderful storyteller. What I want to say is on a daily basis, I come to work here at Gallaudet, and I actually have to pinch myself sometimes. Am I really working with this amazing faculty here? I work with people who are just incredible. Gallaudet has some of the best. We're just champ here, and very supportive environment and information that we want to expand throughout the world. So thank you, USAID, for your support, and we're ready to begin the presentation.
Hello there.
And hello.
And warm welcome. I'm excited to be here. Pamela?
Yes, I'm thrilled to be here as well. And thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to work on this kind of level, global level. So just thrilled to be here as well. We can go on to the next slide, please. So I'll introduce myself. Deanna and I are here to speak about language. We're not giving you our life stories, but as much what we're talking about is how language is so much a part of our daily lives. So I'm deaf. I was born hearing, and at the age of 2, I became deaf. And I had many different experiences. I was in hearing settings, deaf settings, and mainstream settings. I had interpreters at some points, and other situations I didn't have access to that. I went into a hearing school. I did come here to Gallaudet University, a deaf university. And my journey of learning sign language started around the age of 3. At first, my parents were speaking to me, trying to figure out about sign language. And people told my parents to go learn some sign. It was actually my grandfather who said, you need to find other deaf people. Go find them. They will tell you, ask them, what are you going to do with this child? And at that point, my life took on another path because of that. And I'm here to talk about some of that. So at the age of 3, and you can see a picture of me, I did get a body aid, some hearing aids. None of them helped me in any sense. They weren't successful for me. The next picture you can see was the age when I was about 4 years old. And I began to play with some of the sign language that I was introduced to. And you can see with my hands above my head, making a sign for antlers. So language is important in terms of linguistics, we study it, and education and anthropology. All of these are my background.
Mm-hmm.
Within deaf education, most of that focuses on the teaching of language. And sign language is my focus. It's a visual language. We use different technologies, visual aids, use of sign language. I'm using videos all the time. All of that's included with teaching sign language. And in my work, I've worked in another number of these fields. I've worked as a deaf ed. I've taught American Sign Language. I've trained sign language interpreters. I've been involved with theater, with translation project and work. And actually, I do some writing. So all of this that you can see there is connected to what I do with language.
Mm-hmm.
Then you see a group of people in a picture. And the reason I'm showing that is because this picture shows a wealth of diversity. But it's also a picture of language-rich environment.
The most language-rich.
The most language-rich project I ever was involved in. We did some filming there. And in that project, many of these people did not have access or strong language, but they were beginning to practice using sign languages. And we saw the development as they continued along. So this was one of the first groups that I ever taught. One of the boys in the middle that has the blue shirt, he actually just set up a brand new international service organization. I'm incredibly proud of this guy that you see there. And in the bottom, I'm working with Deaf Refugee. It was a group, and I was there to advocate and support these deaf refugees. And I did that work for about 5 years. I also love art. I'm an artist, and I show you something that I did. And then the last image you see is I've become a grandmother. And this is at the point when the baby was 1 week old and I'm already signing. This baby is watching me and I'm beginning to start their language acquisition. All right, Deanna, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, you're right. As Pamela said, I cannot divest myself from my work, my research interests, and my teaching. None of that is divested from the life experience I've had. Those are intertwined and mutually affecting one another. So as I tell you my background, bear that in mind. So there, you see a couple images up top. Those are my parents. And the first image is me with my father, and with both my parents are deaf. And my father was born in the United States and had an identity of as a deaf person at around 2 years old when he first went to schools for deaf, and he was born in 1935. So that's quite some time ago. If you can consider the state of technology in that day, things were very different. He had access to some of those things, but he really benefited from that rich experience in the school for the deaf because his parents were hearing. And then the black and white photo you see there, that is actually in the Dominican Republic. So the baby you see in that image is my mom, who was born in the Dominican Republic, and her family was hearing. As she grew, they realized that she was deaf. But in the Dominican Republic at that time, there weren't many services available. There weren't schools or education really available. And so as my mom was growing up, they were making do as well as they could, and eventually moved to the US when she was 7 years old. So I grew up with both parents signing and in a rich language environment, but affected by their educational experiences, their language experiences. And plus my mother's family also spoke Spanish. When they moved to the US, her family environment was able to give her support and in an English speaking environment. And that was challenging. I, though, got to grow up in that trilingual environment and exchanging information across languages, figuring out meaning across languages, and sometimes navigating that between groups. And that was the context in which I grew, always thinking about language, and because I had to. So as time passed, I have now become a mother. I have 3 kids. Now, my husband is deaf. And so it just so happened that our genes contain genes such that our 2 oldest kids, boys, are hearing, and my youngest child, a daughter, is deaf. Which means that having grown up in a language-rich environment with sign and the language experiences of my parents, and then my research, I'm now presented with a deaf child. I am a person who has to also now think about the application of all of this knowledge, not merely thinking about it in abstract theoretical research terms, but thinking about it in terms of people actually in my life that are depending on the way I'm navigating language and working with language in our life and home. So my youngest daughter now is 6. And the last image that you see speaks to the fact that I've been doing my research in child psychology, specifically in language and language acquisition, how it impacts their development on the whole, how it affects their cognitive development, and indeed looking into the neurobiological structure of language and language acquisition. And so how we have become adults using language as we do. My work has also been international in scope. I have gone to Nicaragua to do work as well. And in Nicaragua, I studied an emerging sign language that has been fascinating to look at that. This really looks at how peers, children, feed each other language that becomes a full language, full-fledged language, and just as strong as a heritage language is that's passed on to a child. These are both things that we're going to discuss today, both the emergence of language and the heritage of language passed on. So, Pamela?
All right, throughout our webinar today, these are a couple of questions we'd like you to already start thinking about. So we're talking about language and communication. Are they the same or are they different? And if they are different, what is different about them? I mean, think about that. What do they have in common? What do they have that are different? We'd like you to begin thinking about that. In some situations, you have language. In others, when you're in communication, can communication actually happen without language? And can language happen and be effective without communication? So these are the questions. These are the things to be thinking about throughout this webinar. And we're also talking about language learning and language acquisition. Language acquisition is something that happens unconsciously. You're learning, but you're not actually aware of that. It's just a natural occurrence. And we'll talk more about that. And then when we talk about language learning, that is something very different. That's something you're doing consciously, and you're aware that you're now in a situation where you're learning. You're focused on that, and you're using certain brain processing where you might have some that you've mapped out, you have things set, and then you're adding additional information as you learn it. Where in language acquisition, that's just coming in naturally. It's something throughout the environment that happens spontaneously. So across the world, we interact with many different people, and there are different languages. There are different regionalisms that happen in languages. There are different dialects that are occurring in different places. And not only that, then down to the individual. Within a certain family, there can be certain ways of communicating using language, even in a school, a residential school for deaf people. So all of this is language diversity, and it's rich, and there's no what's right or wrong about it. It's, who's deciding? Is there something that's right or wrong? Languages are complicated. Some languages are more complicated than others. So these are questions that we're asking and posing at this point. Now, within the deaf community, there's also such diversity. And when we look at sign languages, also spoken languages typically have a written form, but with sign languages, we think about how do they emerge? How were these languages used? Where are they not used? What is some of the intention for the communication? And when they're deaf people, sometimes there's absolutely no language and no communication. What does that actually look like? So a lot of thoughts as we begin our presentation.
Great. So we want you to be considering these questions throughout the presentation. Now, we'd like to tell you a little bit about our plan today. We're going to be talking about what linguistics is as a field. What it is, many people think it just means, people that know a lot of languages and spend their time acquiring languages. We're actually going to speak to that and speak to what linguistics really is. And beyond that, we're going to talk about how linguistics helps us. How does it help us to consider all languages? What does it tell us about language? And what does that tell us about the world and how people use languages across the world? We're going to give different examples from spoken and sign languages today. And we're going to talk about non-linguistic features like gesture and some that can have been largely misunderstood and misconceptions about language. We're going to clarify some of those common misconceptions. And we're not saying any of our participants here believe those, but these are beliefs that are held across the world in lots of populations, and we're going to speak to how those are misconceptions. So we're going to talk about how this language research also affects policies that affect deaf children.
All right, next slide, please.
So what is linguistics? Let's talk about that. Linguistics is the scientific examination of language. It's just like thinking about any other field of science, biology, physics, or chemistry. Each of them have a focus of study. And we're not simply pontificating and throwing opinions out there about how people learn language. We're actually assessing this. We're examining empirical data and evidence to use the scientific method to compare languages, to look into a language. It's almost like looking at a language through a microscope, if you will. Now, the reason we do this is because we know that all languages originate in the human brain, regardless of whether it's a spoken language, a signed language, a tactile language, as deafblind persons would use. All human brains generate language. And yet languages are diverse across the world. So if we're looking at a particular language, we might be examining what's unique about that language. We are also, though, looking at what are common underlying features of language on the whole. Any language that the human brain generates. So there may be contexts that impact language, cultural impacts on language, developmental impacts on language that we're examining. So we're looking on the whole at how people use language. What are the different ways of rhetorical persuasion, or wooing for romance, or to teach, or to raise a child? All of these different ways that we use language. These are ways that we can compare and contrast languages. Now, beyond that, we're also looking at how children acquire a language. Pamela just mentioned that language acquisition is an unconscious process. It's a process in which children, if exposed to a context with a full language, would tend to acquire all of what's needed for that language by age 5. Now, let's compare that to an adult who's intentionally trying to learn a language. It may be the same language, but it's learned as a second language, and they may never get to the same kind of fluency as a native. And explicit teaching happens very differently than the ways in which we're explicit teaching. We're talking about language pairs. We're talking about patterns, correction of the interpretation. We're talking about some of the more basic features of languages. Those are taught differently than they're acquired. And I sometimes say that if adults could do what kids could do, the field of linguistics wouldn't even be around, because we'd all know the answers to everything. But linguistics exists because we have to wonder how children are doing this at 5, acquiring language and like being able to correct a second language user. It's amazing. Now, we're also examining psycholinguistics. This considers how one acquires language and how language impacts one's view of the world and the way they interact in the world, how it impacts a person's way of thinking, the way their ways of being. And we examine how that impacts someone in the first language and how a second, third, and fourth language impact a person as well. And I wrote an article that looks at how people can exhibit different personalities in different languages. So who I am as a signer is different than who I present as an English speaker and who I present as a person who's engaging in written language. And that's even still different than who I am in Spanish. Now, am I a completely different person with multiple personalities? No. In fact, it's just the fact that I am interacting in language that brings forth different parts of me that has different sort of spillover effects because my experiences within that language impact how I'm interacting in that language. So the way I use Spanish was in my family. I have never had academic Spanish training. So my way of expressing myself, my way of joking around in Spanish is going to be very different than it will be in, say, English, where I have a great deal of explicit training in English. And now, interestingly, I've also grown up as a signer my whole life, and yet I never had ASL training. Now, I have taught ASL, but I had to learn through, the hard knocks, really, that has impacted me, in terms of who I have been as a naive signer. As opposed to the experience I had in English, where I had formal training. Each of these languages of language context have interacted how I interact in those languages and how people see me when I'm interacting in those languages.
So a couple of comments to add to that. So when we're talking about language acquisition, and it can be 1, 2, 3, or 4 languages that we're talking about, often people think or understand bilingual competency as, think of a light switch. All right, I'm competent in this language or another one. And when we think about competency, there's a whole range there that you then have access to. And I've realized through my research and study, when we think about competencies, they actually can vary. So it's almost like dials and levers. We can turn them. And we have many different dials. And I'm going to give you an example. With bilingual, I'm ASL and written English. So if I were going to take a test in my fluency in both, I don't have equal fluency. But I might test that way. So if I were tested in ASL, and I've done that, I've had tests since the age of 19, and as a linguist, I've been involved with that. My very first class that I ever taught was ASL Linguistics. But if I had to then type up a paper about this in English, about linguistics, that takes something. I have the English, I understand the English, but my fluency in able to turn those dials and produce this paper in academic writing, and think about poetry. I can understand poetry. I can write English very well. I'm fluent with many different types of literature within the genre of poetry. But if I were to give ASL poetry, I've not done that. I don't have the same fluency. I have it more there in English than I have it in ASL. Another situation could be in a medical situation or humor. How do I express myself in a comic way with anger, the emotions of love? There's all these different settings, and my language competency alters in each of those, and I have different turns to those dials. Something that's very important to be aware of with language is that young children before the age of 1, we're typically around 8 months, they already recognize their language from all other languages in the world. 8-year-olds, if they're listening, they can recognize and pick out what's being produced in their native language. And this starts at the age of 1, that they are able to distinguish that. So can you imagine, the superpowers these little infants already have?
Right. I agree. And now one other note that I'll add here is that's unique to deaf populations is that most deaf kids are not monolinguals. They will always be in some way dialing in that bilingualism. And very often people think that bilingual means that people are going to be confused and have language confusion, or languages affecting one another in ways that will cause them to perform poorly, but that's not true. Oh, the interpreter froze. We need to wait for a moment.
Yes, thank you for noticing that. We're asking Matt if you can switch to the other interpreter. Thank you, Matt.
Okay. So some of my research relates to the bilingual experience. And one thing that I often mention to others is that bilinguals will acquire the languages from their whole language experience. Not all language is in the brain. So it's fine. Children are going to be able to learn a language and learn things in that language, but kids are not going to be confused by learning more than one language. It is not the case that a bilingual who is bilingual in English and Spanish is going to immediately start using, structures from German. I mean, that's just not going to happen, right? They're going to stick with what they know, with what they've gotten, what they've been exposed to. That's how they've acquired the language. So they use what they have. And they also do something called code switching, where they use one language, but will also incorporate intentionally parts of other languages that they know. But there are underlying rules that we can study and see how people are code switching. They know that there are two languages. There's not a confusion between them. It's actually a part of this dual language acquisition that's natural.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So we have a brief video as an example here. The video is from a few years ago. It was during the funeral of Nelson Mandela. You might be familiar with this, you might remember this, but there was news about the interpreter that showed up at his funeral. And we're asking you to watch this interpreter's signing. If you can enlarge the screen and put it full screen. Okay, great, thank you. You can stop it. Now watching this, is this someone, does it look as if someone is just gesturing? Does it actually look like an interpreter? Is there something that you think might be awry with this? Is there something different? Okay, remember this image. I'm going to show you a second video. This is, and if I have this correct, this woman is Indian. And I don't know her sign language at all, but I want you to look at it. Are you recognizing any patterns that you see there? What are you noticing in her signing? Yes, I see people in the chat, more expressive and active, or motion. All right, you can pause it. So comparing the two videos we just watched, did anybody notice something? And please go ahead and put your comments in the chat. Yes, difference in facial expressions. Did you also notice movement and difference in the shoulders and the posture, where the first interpreter was just standing very rigid?
Handshakes. Oh, and handshakes, variety of them. Yep.
All right, can we go back one slide to the first interpreter, that example? I'd like to point something out. The first interpreter kept repeating the same hand movements throughout. And look at what I'm doing. Just complete repetition of a few hand movements. You got it. All of you in the audience, great. Okay, Go to the next slide, please. So we were comparing them. You've already answered this in the chat. Completely different examples. The woman is an interpreter, and she has language and facial expressions, gamma. She's using face to represent things, and you can see there's a lot of complex language going on there. It's a clear example of language where the gentleman is repeating a certain movement. When someone says the same hand movements over and over, this was a horrible situation that occurred. He's standing next to important dignitaries. You know, the world is watching. These are world leaders, and they have this person standing on stage right next to them. So this can help us create awareness out of there. People who don't know a sign language would allow something like this to happen. This is not language. And you can tell it. Even though you don't know the languages, you can see it instantly.
Exactly. And I think, as Pamela mentioned, even though these are two sign languages I don't know, I can still see patterns, because this is, patterns are familiar to me. I can tell that one of them doesn't know sign language. I can tell that that's not even a sentence that they've uttered. Despite not knowing their languages, when seeing them produce it, or even when you're hearing somebody with speaking gibberish, you can tell that that's not language, that it's just vocal gestures or manual gestures. In either case, you can tell the difference between gesture and language by the use of patterns. And it's the complexity of patterns, not the repetitive simplicity of a single pattern.
All right, next slide, please. So again, just sitting back watching, we can see the difference in what is being produced. But who makes these decisions about something is right or wrong? So for example, I have students, and we often engage in conversations about hand shapes within American Sign Language. And watch me, I'm producing different hand shapes. Do they mean the same thing? Is there an impact if you're using it differently? And I'm going to pause for a moment. The interpreter has frozen again.
No, sure.
Okay, we're going to switch. Thank you for recognizing and alerting us that the interpreter has. Thanks.
I know. Okay, go ahead.
So looking at these hand shapes, and do you see the different hand shapes I'm making right now? If we are to study them, is there a difference? What amount of difference, and you're watching my thumb placement, what amount of difference makes a difference in a language? And that's some of what we can analyze. We have an intuitive sense when we watch it, if we're language users. Now, within scientific approach, we set up various experiments with criteria. We set up the parameters. There are certain factors that are involved with any type of scientific experiment that we can then measure, because we want that to be an unbiased observation, an understanding of something in terms of the data that we're collecting. And we work very hard in collecting various data from diverse samples to then look, what patterns are we seeing? And all of that includes diversity. But that's empirical evidence research. And we do that in linguistics. The next example is something near and dear to me. This is something that now we've just discussed language. The next thing we're showing is not language, and yet you can see certain things you can identify. So as linguists, we argue for what's there, what features are being produced to tell us that it's language. And then we can look at another example and say, these features are not present. So language is not there. And it's very clear to be able to look at this. But this other category is communication. And we have to measure that differently, or that's our question. When communication is happening, is it always from language?
Because these honeybees can communicate. She said.
All right, we can stop the video. Great. So this is fascinating, watching this dance that the bees perform, and they're communicating the distance of where they found nectar. I mean, it's incredible, absolutely incredible. There's certain patterns that these bees have that include time, distance, incredibly complex, the information that they can provide. They're actually talking about something that's not present to them right at that moment. It's something at a distance, and they're communicating about it. Now, we haven't studied that they can talk about time like yesterday or tomorrow, but they can talk about distance. And they do this in different patterns. Now, they can't talk about something that they did previously, or why don't we do something? And they can't talk about, let's have some fun here. That's not what they're talking about.
Right. And so they can't say, you know what, I'm going to go try and find that honey myself. They don't have that kind of communication interchange.
That's right. They don't have that interchange, or they can't ask for clarification. Like, what did you say? What does that mean? So that's a communication. And communication obviously can be incredibly complex and in depth, but linguistic features might not always be there.
And let me add to that, that this doesn't mean that we are devaluing the kind of communication bees are engaging in. It's the same idea is really, when any scholar is looking at the scope of their research, they have to look at other areas of research that may abut but not overlap. And so they're looking at how those things can, but this biology, and chemistry are related fields, and yet they're not the same field. That's what we're saying. We're saying here that linguistics is the study of language specifically, and we have to define where that ends, where there exists beyond that communication that may be profound and amazing, and yet not be linguistic in nature.
And we have huge fields of study about paralinguistics, which is more communication features that are outside of linguistic features. All right, next slide, please. And please go ahead and read the slide. And next slide. Now, I don't know the Nigerian sign for football. Is that your sign for football? All right, great. Thank you for teaching that. Great, thank you. I wasn't sure I had the right sign there. So suppose you were to go watch a game of football. If you were doing that as everyone's arriving to the stadium, the game's about to begin. No one's discussing how are we going to get into the stadium. No one has to discuss which door do we get in to access it, right? That's just something innate. We know, and we keep going and we walk in. We don't discuss where we get the food, maybe even where the restroom is. We know this, so it doesn't require any language and discussion. We don't say something like, okay, we have to walk and we have to find the front door and then we have to go in the front door. We don't discuss that. So when and where did we learn all of that information? Did someone actually sit down and instruction by instruction teach us that? No, most of us learn this just visually. And we applied this in our daily lives, and we acquired this, even about where we're going to sit. How do we as individuals know we're allowed to sit here, but we're not allowed to go up front and start engaging with the players? How do we know this? How do we know that we're also not supposed to go and engage with the announcers of the game? We know this. We know to come in, find our seat, and start cheering. And again, how do we know all of this? This is physical movement where we're seating. We know not to like lean over into the person sitting next to us. We know which areas we're supposed to walk up and down the stairs, not walk through all of the audience members. This is all acquisition that we take in. We've learned this, and we might not realize it at the moment we're learning it, but we are learning a lot of complex information. Now, each person that would be in this stadium actually has their own role. Each one of them, from those sitting as spectators to the merchants selling the food, to security that might be there, the actual players, the coaches, every individual has a role. And it's all there together. And we haven't discussed, okay, who's taking this role? What's this role? It's just something that we know, and we all integrate it together and we work. And that's similar to what's happening with language. Language itself is a community. There are people who interact in a certain language, and they're using it on a daily basis in many settings. And it's very similar to this image of the stadium, the soccer game. So in this example, with the players, they use certain muscles.
They don't think about it.
And they don't think about which muscle, like, is your arm, is that muscle important for this? They're not thinking about which muscle. But if you were a player, you know, if any one muscle is not working, it's going to have an impact on the total amount of ability or skill that you have. It's going to impact the entire game if a muscle is not working. And this is experiences that we all share, very similar, I'm making the analogy, to language. Language is as equally complex a phenomenon. Each individual person there can be seen as an individual language feature. It's one part of one incredibly complex language. And you can look at one individual part like an individual person. You take one player out of the game, then you put in a new player, someone else, the whole energy shifts. Similar with language. Deanna, is there anything you want to add at this point?
No,
All right, well,
good.
go to the next slide. So again, in a football stadium, use the example of one language, and I'll pick Spanish for this example. If everyone is using Spanish, but we also have to think about, is it Spanish spoken in Mexico or Spanish spoken in Puerto Rico? These are not exactly the same languages. Both of them would be considered Spanish, and yet they're not quite the same. That's what I meant by you have two different football stadiums. You might have one stadium, and then you think about a second stadium. They pretty much have a lot of similarities, and yet they're still going to have their differences. There's still languages in these countries, but there are differences. And if they're a language, they have to include certain features. And here's a list on the slide of features. They're spoken within a community. They're used for interactions. They have meaning based in different contexts. So it's not one meaning that's being used, but in various contexts, it can mean something different. So if you're speaking to one person, you might be signing something, you sign it to someone else, you shift the meaning based on the roles of the individuals in that communication exchange. If you're talking with children, children are acquiring language, and as they're acquiring it, they're seeing this through massive amounts of interaction and multiple different contexts. They're doing it within a particular community, then they might see it in another community. They'll see how their language is being used in a family as opposed to out in a community. And as we mentioned, infants, young infants begin to learn this at a very young age. Now, most people think of languages at the next stage, sentence structure and vocabulary. That's what they envision is in a language. People don't realize all of this. Every one of those rungs on this are what's included in language.
And I'll also say that the complexity of this is amazing. And so we were talking about some of the previous ideas now, people, when we were showing the examples of the interpreters, you mentioned features that were missing or present. And each of those has a role. Those expressions aren't just emotive. They're not just expressing emotion, but there's something happening there. And it's in the parlance of this analogy of the muscle in the player. Each of them is vitally important. And so in spoken language, each sound, each phoneme is part of a word, can change the entire meaning of the word on the whole, right?
Yes, and you can see on the image here, it starts with articulation, then building blocks, and all of it is, it's not as if it's one stage and the next, it's all working together. All of this together is what produces language.
Okay, next slide.
Now we're shifting to linguistics, the study of all of this. It's a very formal word for actually the same thing we just saw, the study of language. So pragmatics. Pragmatics is interaction. Semantics. In our field of linguistics, it talks about meaning and context. So the same rungs here, just the linguistic terms applied. Okay, next slide. So just imagine you have this football team and they need a new coach. Just imagine. So they advertise for a coach. Do they want an American football coach? The photo you see on the top, no, they don't. That's a completely different world, different culture, different language, American football, different structure. So if you need a new coach for a football team, you're not going to hire an American football coach. You're not going to hire a rugby coach. Even though it might look similar, you might say it's close enough. It's actually a completely different world. It's completely different. So close enough doesn't count. We're talking about you need to take the whole, so the whole of language, the whole of what that sport is. You can't play even a single game if you're going to all of a sudden institute new rules. It just doesn't mix. It doesn't work. So with the language, it has its own patterns and complexity. And if you want to pull in another language and try to make it work, it's not going to work. It would be just like bringing an American football coach to help your football team. You don't want something like that to happen, right? So think about that. We also don't want that to happen in language.
Well, and to clarify, you mean now mixing by native people who are doing this expressively is done intentionally, and that is known as code switching and is a natural part of this language acquisition, as opposed to this random grabbing and grab bag of language, mixing them between two different languages. That doesn't work.
That's right. That's right. And even forcing these different languages in. You're right. Okay, next slide. All right, you want to take this one, Deanna?
So, what is language? So far, we've talked about how one acquires a language. We've talked about the various parts of language and parse that out. Let's also look at what it is. It's a rule-governed system, not one with random rules created just by one authority on high. In fact, children, when they're in the process of acquisition of a language, are creating and mapping patterns. These patterns and expected patterns are the rules that we speak of. Linguists are studying what people do naturally. That's what becomes the grammar of a language and the grammar that's taught. But ironically, those grammar books are some generally behind the actual evolution of the language that's living and breathing in a community. because language is never static, it's ever evolving, and it's always changing in the hands of the children using it. This is the natural creative process, that is part of acquiring a language. So as linguists, that's what we're trying to study. We're examining what the features of language are and what are held in common across languages, whether they be spoken or signed. And remember, we talked about linguistics and how we separate that from the field of communication. So let's say that we come into a classroom and we're examining languages in this environment. We're going to look at what the variations are, what's held in common. Those variations are going to happen with some reason. Now, as a biologist, if I'm studying a cell, I'm going to be looking at a cell in one environment, and I might be examining what happens when I put that cell in a different environment, because we already understand the basic function and structure of what cells are and how they work across different types of cells and environments. Okay, next slide.
So we've talked about patterns. It's something that we recognize across all languages in the world. Languages have patterns, and here's a couple of them. So they're consistent. Now, not everyone uses everything the same way, but in general, this language is consistent with all of the diversity that it has. So consistency is one, as well as it's varied. And what we mean by that, again, I'm going to use the analogy of football. They're players. Now, players don't run and kick the same way every single time they make a play. But in football, everyone is kicking and everyone is running. They're doing that within the bounds. They know where they're supposed to stay. They know their particular position. And that's very important. And those things are set. They know that they can't pick up the ball with their hands. They know they can't do that because then they would be out of the game. But there's certain ways that they're moving that are based on rules. It is a rule-governed game. But then how they individually run or how they respond in any play in any given moment, that's where it varies. Hopefully this was a clear analogy. So there is a system, it's rule-governed, and there is still variance within that. Now, also, languages need to be effortless. People are able to produce them with comfort and ease. If people had to stop and think and it was more robotic, that would not be a language. Languages don't develop that way. Languages are learned and they're effortless. And with languages, they're used for interaction. They must be interchangeable between two or more people. It's not only a one-way thing for talking about languages. There's something that can be inter-exchanged, or whether you're in that exchange or you're just observing the exchange of others.
Right, think about the honeybee example, right? They have this beautiful ability to tell the other bees in the colony where food exists and what directions. And so this is implicit knowledge that you can let me know, right? If it's important. But the honeybee doesn't come and just waggle dance for no reason. There has to be a functional, information-driven reason. And the honeybees don't have any dialogue going in more directions and then just the single informative task of letting you know where things are.
The next part for language is they have to be efficient. It shouldn't be too complex or too hard to be able to use language. Languages are efficient. They're short and sweet, and you can get the point across. They're also automatic. They're spontaneous. And then they vary across different contexts. And then most important, they need to be accessible to the users. You can't develop a full language with only having certain parts, only receiving certain parts. You need the whole to be able to use the language. Next slide. Another example, we already talked about the one with football, but think about this, planting. This is cocoa farming. And if you were to imagine setting these beds, there's certain technology that you can use to plant. And you can see how it's done very particularly. It's very clear that there's a pattern here. It's actually quite beautiful. This image is really stunning. It's beautiful of these plantings. So there's efficiency to this system. Just imagine you wanted to create a new farm, but instead of doing this, you just randomly sprinkled the seeds in different directions. And you just planted them in different places. Would that garden be as effective as this one? It wouldn't be. Here, it's easy to sow and reap this from this actual example. And children are learning this. They're taking this in. This is part of how language is acquired. It's wonderful, it's rich, and it's part of how we learn, as opposed to just randomly without any system. Yes, the product will grow, but it wouldn't be as efficient as doing something like this. And I love this metaphor. I think it helps to make that a really clear point. Right, next slide.
So if there's anything I love about linguistics, it's about how all of it is implicated. And all of these parts are implicated in language. We refer to this sometimes as the 5 C's because language has to have communication, right? And we said that there is a line between communication and linguistics, but that's only as a field of study, because you can have communication without language. And later we're going to talk about how you can have language occur without communication, but they are nonetheless overlapping in that we use language as a part of our humanness in order to communicate with others. So we want to be able to connect with others. We want to do so efficiently. We want to be able to tell people about our events. We want it to be interactive, interchangeable. We want to be able to do all of this efficiently. And in order to do that, we must have a grammar, right? If all of our communication was like, that artificial and that fake interpreter example that we had, this webinar would not be able to happen at all, right? This building wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be able to do that. To have, we need complex language to be able to hold ideas for discussion and deliberation, and to build on concepts. The advancement of humans has not been because of the advancement in technology. It's been because of our human brain's capacity for language and the ability to interact with one another, to create cultures, to connect with one another, and to compare across communities and cultures. And that's how communities have thrived and languages have contributed to that.
You know, there's something that just blows my mind. It's wonderful. It's Socrates. So we're going back many years, over 300 or 400 BC, 400 BC, if I have the actual time period correct. Notice deaf people signing. We have information about that deaf people had intelligence and they developed that through sign language. That was already noticed back in 400 BC. It just blows my mind. That's incredible. That there were deaf people and they were using language and they were communicating through a sign language. They were able to connect with each other. And so I have a strong belief that for communication, this is a desire of all people, that we're born ready as people with this desire to communicate. But not everybody is given the same access to language as everyone else. It's that access to it that helps develop that fluency and efficiency, but we are all born with that desire all across the globe.
Great. Next slide.
So you can see here
Gradient.
the gradients here. We have language and we have communicate. There's so much more than we even understand. You know, we look at a sign, we see people dressed, the way someone is seated, the way someone is standing, how individuals work, how we pass someone by, the facial expressions we have, how we take in a breath can actually produce a communication. It's all communication that's occurring. Communication is vast and in many different ways. And then we look at language and we see that that's smaller. And language is incredibly complex, and yet it's not as vast maybe as communication. Now, can we have language without communication? Yeah, I mean, I could meet a person. I know English and ASL. I might meet another individual who knows only French. And that person starts speaking French, so they're using a language. I know languages, but are we communicating if that person is only using spoken French? No, we're not. I meet a hearing person even here who uses spoken English. They're using a language and they're speaking out loud, but I wouldn't have access. So that's not communication that would be happening. So the challenge is when someone is speaking that way, or they're using a sign language and they're not recognizing communication is not happening. The person uttering the language has to be aware of what's happening at the other end. Is communication actually happening? Is it effective? Because if someone is just speaking as if the person watching is receiving it, that's not always happening. So it's a give and take, and it's checking in. Language might be being used, but communication is not happening.
Only if it's understood by both parties.
It has to be understood by both parties.
Right. So you can have language exist without communication. And have you ever experienced this, even when you share the same language? Like if I'm just thinking to myself and I'm just, talking to myself, either signing or speaking to myself verbally, and somebody will say, what? Oh, never mind. Sorry. Because I wasn't intending to communicate that text to you. I was just languaging to myself, right? I was using language without communication. That's another example. And it's similar to when we talk about a language must be accessible. It's ironic because my daughter, who I mentioned is deaf, sometimes I'll look at her and she'll give me a sassy eye roll, or be sassing back and talking and trying to argue a point and say, why is that? Why does that have to be that way? And want to know more about something in the world, right? And so sometimes as a parent, we know we could just have an exasperated sigh about it. But in fact, I try to remember that she's got the language to be able to ask that, to interrogate the world, to ask and learn about parts of the world. And that's something not every deaf kid gets. If you don't have sufficient access to the materials of language to be able to talk about these things, then you can't ask those questions. You simply proceed through life getting by as best you can. It's an analogy. It's a good analogy to the football team that has everybody there and nobody is actually seeing the stadium. Nobody's seeing what's happening there. Everybody's just seeing a microcosm of what they see through a visor, and they're only seeing a little fraction of the game. So we need to be able to give someone rich access to a language, but also it has to be dialogic for them to be able to communicate. They have to be able to be understood by both parties.
Another example that I'm thinking of, sometimes I'm working with another person and I might have a thought or an idea and I have an understanding of what that is. Now the person next to me might have another thought or idea, but this could be something different. So we're communicating with American Sign Language. I'm signing, the other person is signing. We think we might be talking about the same thing, and yet actually we're not in each other's world. We're not talking about the same thing. That can happen. We're both using language. We think we're communicating, but in that moment, we're actually having different thoughts and we're not. So children are similar. Children are learning language. You see this happening. They're learning vocabulary, but the use of it, especially in different contexts, where they're using it to have a discussion, to persuade, they want to ask questions. Maybe they are asking their friend something as opposed to asking another adult or asking the teacher, asking an employer. In these different contexts, it's different. So you're never just teaching something one way and then expecting them to be effective in these different contexts.
Okay, good. Okay. So now we're going to throw out there a few common misconceptions people have about language in general. And I know that we're short on time, so we're going to go through this fairly quickly. The first, many people mistakenly believe that language, signed language, is just a way to make a spoken language visible. Now, part of the reason for that is because so many signers have not actually grown up as native signers. They know English or they know a spoken language and then later learn sign language, but they haven't learned the underlying grammar of that signed language. So they're exhibiting the grammar of the spoken language and applying it to the signed language. But this is actually a misconception. Another one is that many people believe that signed languages are just, simpler, broken down versions of a more complex spoken language, and that is untrue. That's false. This goes back to the concept of all of that rich complexity of sign that happens in expression. So if I utter the sign want or what, correction, and it's only on my hands, then they're not going to get that. I have to have the expressive part of it to show that it's a question or show that it's a topic marker. It's not just emotive. Those facial expressions have meaning. They have grammar. The same way we use intonation of a voice, the rise and fall of it indicates something that's beyond just emotion, but also grammatical. So many people also mistakenly believe that because sign language is going to be easy and we should just create a universal sign language. Right? But each country has their own language that's used within that realm. And it's been mentioned before that we have the Spanish in Puerto Rico differs from the Spanish in Nicaragua, which differs from the Spanish used in Spain. Each of these have commonalities between them, but they are still unique. And we couldn't tell them all, nope, you must use one single Spanish. That's just not the case. Languages develop within the context of a community that uses them. So we're going to talk about 3 more now.
Right. If you're trying to force these things at the same time, you're going to lose that diversity. So we're saying we strongly believe so monoculture is not any way that a person is going to thrive. Diversity is so important there, that people are interacting through various experiences. Like think of Norway. They have a different environment. It's colder. There are mountains. Fish is so important to the people who live there and their culture. So they would have language and sign languages that suit that. Then we think about Nigeria. If we were to force the language used in Norway into people living in interacting in Nigeria, it doesn't work. In the United States, we mentioned before, American football is different than the world's football. There's a different culture, different ways and rules, how you play that game. Diversity is a strength and it provides beauty and strength for language. Okay, next slide. We've talked about this one already. We've touched on this.
Yeah, I think we can move on to the next slide.
One thing that I want to point is that sign language is based on visual needs. So auditory language is based on sound. The sound comes in, and when you speak, there's certain parts of the language that are developed because of sound. It's auditory. And that fits the use, the vocal production, the way language is produced, how you hear it. It all works together. The production and the
we speak the way we do.
We speak the way we do because we hear the way we do. Now with sign language, it's a visual language. So people who are speaking have a feedback loop in hearing themselves. Sign language is different. It's not based on the hearing. And so sign language is done visually.
What's most important is that we give children full access to a full language. Exactly. Sign languages, just like any other spoken language, we don't have one-to-one correspondences between items within that language. When we say, how are you in English, we use 3 words. How are you? But in Hausa, it appears that there's only 2. Now, I hope I'm saying this right. Yaya kake And that is going to be very different than ASL, how you, the two, with only two vocabulary items there, right? That's going to be very different than in Spanish, como está. We can't compare a one-to-one correlation between languages because languages pack information differently, if you will. All the same information is there. Each of these expressions is equivalent, yet different.
Next slide.
So we've talked about these similarities and the way we use a single sentence in Spanish, for example, and then if we try to just use that same structure but pack English words into that structure, how am I going to say it? Is that English? Is that now Spanish? Never. Both have lost something. It's neither, because those languages are not put together in the right way. The way that the English words are put in the Spanish grammatical structure doesn't work. And the same thing is true if we are signing in a sentence and only replicating how it's done in a spoken language, then we're trying to fit circle into a square, so to speak. We're trying to do things that can't be done with the language. We're using it wrong.
Now, one of my favorite web pages shows untranslatable terms you cannot change from one to another language. And I'd be happy to share that with you as examples of terms that you cannot translate. They just don't translate back and forth from one language to another. And that's part of that diversity of languages. Certain languages might focus on particular movement. So in English, we talk about balls are bouncing. And there's a word for bounce. But in Spanish, we would say, and that would be the ball is bounced out of the house. The way we set up that sentences are very different. And if you're trying to plug one into the other, it's not going to work.
Right. Okay, next example. Next slide. Great. If you are curious to know more about the things that we've talked about people who have tried to intentionally create an artificial language, I highly recommend this book. It was a surprise to me when I read this. It seems, very easy to read. It's not, ivory tower linguistics. This is a linguist, but who has studied the history of artificial languages. And there are over 400 artificially created languages, spoken languages, not signed languages. People have tried time and again to create a universal language, and it never works. It never works because of the kids, because of the children. As adults, we interact, we go to work, we do all of these things, but let's think about how children's lives exist. So children acquire a language by 5 years old. What they're exposed to by 5 is going to define their language use for the rest of their life. That becomes their foundational language. That becomes the way they frame the world and the way they frame anything. You can expose them to more than one language, 3, 4 languages. At that point, we start tapering off how much time they can spend in each language when we pack more languages into that early childhood experience. But how do we make, there's no way to make that childhood language experience universal. They're going through the world, navigating their days with their families, with their friends, with their school, in languages. Those are the languages that become the language of the child. Adults think we're so smart trying to create this artificial language, and yet it never trickles down to be part of the children's daily lived experiences. So that's an interesting point.
Right, next slide.
So similarly, an artificial approach to create a global signed language won't work. So human language has commonalities across language, but they're not the same across the world. And neither can sign language be forced to fit that single box, right? And language is made up of the things that we do in experience every day. Some of that is common to all of us, but some of it is not. We're never going to be able to enforce an artificial language.
Another example that is specific to culture in America, this is the sign for frog. And in Nigeria, what is the sign for frog? Oh, okay, that one's similar. So it's a similar sign. Now in Burma, Myanmar, the sign is this for frog. And during any rain period, it talks about the rain and the frog movement. So they add weather and geography. The weather and geography of that area has impacted the sign, where it's not done the same in American Sign Language. So what fits there, the life that people are living in their environment actually influences that language.
Okay, next slide. So I think we've spoken to this really in many ways, but we have to consider. Oh, go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, go to the next slide if you would, as the parts of language. Okay. When we're considering deaf children, they need an accessible language. They need a natural language, not an artificial language that's been intentionally created. And whether that's English or Hausa, you couldn't do an English sentence, an English grammatical structure with Hausa words, right? So we need instead to bring people who use this language or that language to be the language models for that child. So if I want my child to become fluent in the language of another place, say Mandarin, I want my child to be fluent in Mandarin. It doesn't make sense to me for me to first go learn Mandarin and then for me to become the educator of my child in Mandarin, right? I'm going to have less adept use of Mandarin. The best thing to do if I want my child to acquire Mandarin as a language is to expose them to native Mandarin speakers and expose them to in context where they're going to be using Mandarin with other kids their age. The same thing is true of sign language. We want signers who are adept in that language, who know that language and have grown up in it, who can talk about a wide variety of topics in that language. That creates a more interactive experience. Now, those children are learning those languages in the context of other kids. Having a single one-to-one correlation between a single teacher and a single language model and a single language learner doesn't work. We need a variety of language exposures and language models in their environment, both adult and child peers, using language for the children to acquire language naturally. But we recognize this can be very difficult for deaf kids because deaf kids are born often singly into families that are spread across a wide area. Now, we would still want to hold on to that ideal of language acquisition and achieve as close as we can to that ideal.
All right, next slide. I think we've covered this information.
Yeah. I think we'll hold this for last.
So in wrapping up now, we want you to think about some of the ideas that we've covered in this last hour and a half with all of you. We've covered a lot. We've talked about, what could language models be? What information do children acquire from? And who should these language models be? So we're not answering these questions specifically. We've just presented information to all of you. And these are the questions we want you to think about. Reflect on these. What language models and what access can you provide to deaf children in learning sign languages? You can see here, access, providing access to it, and exposure. Next slide. Look at all of this interaction that's happening amongst different people. We learn from adults. Also, we acquire language from peers. You practice it. You might be learning it from some person, but you're not going to be practicing it as a child as much. You practice that with your peers. And when you can practice within the age of 8 to 15, this is when, young people are practicing, making mistakes, learning, engaging A lot of language acquisition happens there.
Yeah, just skip over, if you will, towards the end. And at this point, we just want to thank everyone. I don't know, there might be a minute, maybe 2 left for a question.
Thank you. Thank both of you today. And I'd like to thank everyone who's been a part of this webinar today. We're out of time at this point. We thank USAID. We thank our audience, everyone who's joined. We thank Gallaudet. We thank our interpreters, our card provider, everyone. We've had 2 wonderful presenters. Thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise and your knowledge with all of us. There aren't any questions presently.
Any questions you have to us, though?
Sure. People know how to reach out to us, and we will do that. At this point, I just want to do one introduction within our Deaf-E3 team for our director. Also, the director, she's been the dean of the faculty at Gallaudet University, and she's now Gallaudet's next provost. And that is Khadija Rashid.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you to our panelists, Deanna and Pamela. Thank you. That was a wonderful opportunity. I know that Gallaudet has outstanding faculty, but to learn in your class this morning has been a wonderful experience. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and it gave me much to consider about whether communication can exist without language or language without communication. This was a great lens. Thank you both so much. And I hope that everyone has learned as much as I did today and enjoyed watching this presentation and learning what we have. Thank you all for coming and participating in this event today, in this webinar. And that's really all I came to say. I just wanted to express my profound thanks.
Thank you. If anyone has questions, please feel free to reach out to us as presenters. We're very happy to answer the best we can. I will add, and I put my email in the chat. So again, if anyone has questions for the presenters, I will make sure to forward those on so that they can answer and respond. But thank you all. Go forth and have a beautiful day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.